Okay, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're based. Welcome back to the PAX Protection of Civilians Conference. At least welcome back if you've tuned in before, and welcome if this is the first session that you're joining. My name is Erin Bijl. I'm a senior project officer with the PAX Protection of Civilians program, and together with my colleague, Mark Lesko, military advisor at PAX, I will be co-facilitating this session. So this session is called Accountability in Practice, Examples from ISAF and AFRICOM. So what we're doing today is we have 4 sessions which are all about the theme of accountability towards affected civilians during military missions. For those who are new to the conference, this morning we had 2 sessions on the Dutch bombardment of Hawija in 2015 as part of the Operation Inherent Resolve. And I think in both these sessions we saw that people there still really strongly feel that there is a lack of accountability, a lack of steps taken by the Dutch military to actually address the consequences of their actions. Now, because I think we also want a bit more of a positive note today, so what we propose in this session is to discuss 2 examples, 2 initiatives by security actors to actually already take some step towards ensuring accountability towards civilians. These will be initiatives by the former NATO mission in Afghanistan, ISAF, as well as by a current initiative by the US Africa Command. Now, I think we will also hear from our speakers that even though these may be positive examples in some way, they're also riddled with limitations, and still a lot of work needs to be done. But I'll leave that to our speakers. Before introducing the speakers, I would quickly like to go over a few housekeeping notes, just for those people participating online. First of all, please note that this session will be recorded and that we will share recordings of the session a few days after the conference on our website. We also very much like to encourage active participation during this conference. So for people in the room, that means that once we get to a Q&A section, please raise your hand and you can walk to the microphone and that way ask questions to our speakers. For people participating remotely, you can use the Slido module to input questions or comments throughout the session, and we will get to those once we're in the Q&A section. If you're in full screen mode now, you might not see the Slido module, so if you want to use it, please exit full screen mode, and you are free to input your questions and comments. If you find that you want to know more about the topics we are discussing here today, please note that there is a resource library on the homepage of our event platform, where you can find additional reports, articles, op-eds, anything you want, often suggested to us by our speakers on the topics we are addressing here today. If you're participating and you are promoting that participation on social media, please feel free to use the hashtag PAX PoC 2021 or to tag us at PAX PoC, and I'm sure that our speakers would also welcome to be tagged in any reflections you have on their contributions. Finally, I think the most important note is that if, as a remote participant, you're running into technical difficulties at any point throughout the session, you can again go to the homepage and use the drop-down menu to find a live help desk where people can assist you with any issues that you are facing. Now I already see that we have our speakers online, so a big welcome, Sahr, Chris, and Abdullahi. It's really great to see you and to have this conversation with you today. So as I said, we are going to be talking about 2 accountability initiatives. Sahr will be interviewed by Mark on ISAF, and I will have a conversation with Abdullahi and Chris on US AFRICOM. Now, before we move to the first part on ISAF, I'd quickly like to say a few words of introduction already about the second part of our panel. So with us are Abdullahi Hassan and Chris Woods for that panel. So Abdullahi is a Somalia researcher with Amnesty International, who is currently actually on a sabbatical to pursue an additional law degree at Columbia Law University. So we are very happy that he's here to speak in his capacity as an Amnesty after all. Abdullahi has been very critical towards bringing toward public attention much of the impact of US operations in Somalia, which was a topic that I think before Amnesty really started to engage on it was not much heard of. Was a lot of secrecy and lack of transparency around it. Then there's also Chris Woods in the panel, the outgoing director of Airwars. I think we all know Airwars as a monitoring organization that has been absolutely critical in changing the way we talk about remote interventions and their impact on civilians. Airwars has been absolutely instrumental in providing insight into the fact that a lot of civilian harm is being perpetrated in these remote interventions, and has often, with its own tallies, contradicted much lower official counts of civilian harm in these contexts. Mark, I'll leave it to you to introduce Sahr.
Hey, thanks a lot, Erin. So Sahr Muhammedally is the director of MENA and South Asia at the Center for Civilians in Conflict, also known as CIVIC. It's an NGO that's focused on ensuring that a world where no civilians are harmed in conflict. She's an expert and truly a world leader on the protection of civilians, particularly looking at civilian harm mitigation and urban operations. She's here today to talk to us about accountability mechanisms implemented by ISAF, the International Security Assistance Force, which was the NATO mission in Afghanistan, and what worked, what didn't, the transition to Resolute Support in 2015, but most importantly, she's going to help us draw out the positives and the negatives from this experience. So Sahr, I'm going to turn to you now and ask you to first talk to us about the amends process in Afghanistan and how it worked there for NATO. When I was in Afghanistan, it really struck me that there was a lack of standardization and there were numerous problems with ex gratia payments. It almost seemed like Afghans were treated differently depending on where they lived and who it was that harmed them. And yet there was an ex gratia program and they were taken care of to some extent. So now I'd like to hear your perspective on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks to PAX for inviting me. And it's an honor to be on co-panelists with colleagues from Airwars and Amnesty. So I think it is important there are a lot of challenges, as I think was Erin, as you sort of laid out earlier, but there are also some positives that we can sort of discuss and sort of share. Mark, going to your question, I think that, there is, back in 2002 when the US, 2001 when the US intervened in Afghanistan, there was, a lot of us that were starting to engage over there. There was no, and again, going back to CIVIC's founder, Mala Razika, who went to Afghanistan in 2002, there was no acknowledgement of civilian harm by the US military. As many of you know, civilian deaths, injury, and property damage are just considered as collateral damage, and under IHL or rules of engagement, they just sort of put aside and dismissed, and most militaries sort of move on. And I think it took a lot of effort to get the US to actually acknowledge that civilian harm that has been deemed to be collateral harm should be acknowledged, and policies, trainings, etc., need to change in order to try to mitigate the civilian harm, as well as acknowledging to the families and to recognize the losses that families experience because of military operations. And I think it's, so when Marla Razika was there, I mean, she was, knocking on the US military's door. Finally, there were some changes, and the US military did go back to one of its US Army regulation of Somalia, basically providing some sort of financial payment or ex gratia payment to aggrieved families. But, when CIVIC has sort of expounded and really advocated the concept of amends, it's not just financial assistance, it is a broader acknowledgement to the families that they have suffered losses. And slowly, we did see in Afghanistan that, colonels, captains, generals were going to meeting with families and apologizing and acknowledging that mistakes did take place during operations. Other ISAF troop contributing countries, and again, every country has its own policies on this particular issue of amends, because there's a very robust legal framework. Of course, there are challenges in implementation, but there is a legal framework of reparations for violations of international humanitarian law. But there is nothing really as such for if something has been determined to be incidental harm or permissible within the rules of engagement and lawful, what happens to those families? What happens? So I think it became it was driven by policy and as well as from a strategic lens in Afghanistan, where the US and other ISAF troop contributing countries started acknowledging civilian harm and then providing some sort of ex gratia payments. But Mark, going to your question, each troop contributing country had a very different system, and CIVIC wrote a report about it because, Afghan civilians were very confused. How could you know who's responsible for the airstrike or for the particular indirect fire that was used or for property damage? So the onus really became on civilians to, go to the FOB, to the forward operating base, knock on the door at the gate, and also be exposed to, threats from the forces over there and say, well, our families were injured or somebody died in the family. So onus was very much on the families to go to ISAF. So finally, in 2010, the North Atlantic Council, NATO, enacted an amends policy for ISAF, which I think gave some sort of clarity and some sort of consistency to try to ameliorate some of the problems that we identified. And then correspondingly, if I can just add, beyond amends, I think what started happening was a recognition that, yes, it's great to acknowledge civilian harm, but what is being done to prevent this from happening? And I think there were some really positive measures that were taken to track civilian harm incidents from ISAF operations. I mean, this is again going back to 2006, where there were big airstrikes taking place at wedding parties, Azizabad, Farah province, Kunduz, 2006, 2007, and many of us. Mark, I know you wrote that really great report, Troops in Contact, for Human Rights Watch, but many of us would go and speak to ISAF and they didn't have their own data about what happened. Yes, most militaries conduct battle damage assessments, but they don't include civilian harm and deaths to, civilian deaths, injuries, and property damage. So I think it's really important as part of this acknowledgement or accountability framework that we talk about these good sort of tools that were enacted to try to assess the impact of military operations on civilians through these, the civilian casualty tracking mechanism was set up. There, in terms of, again, if you look at an accountability framework, the CCMT, the Civilian Casualty Mitigation Team, and others were conducting interviews with witnesses. I mean, that's just unheard of these days, But I mean, that used to happen. I mean, when you think about those with sort of the good days, I mean, I'm sorry I'm even saying that from us, from that lens, because of course, nothing can bring back the loss that families suffer. And I've spoken to hundreds of families and thousands of families over the last 2 decades in different conflicts. But the fact that there was this assessment process, that there was an acknowledgement that led to, a lot of internal studies and reports that led to changes in directive and policies. And we have data to show that this led to a reduction of civilian harm. And I think that, again, it didn't lead to zero civilian harm because that's just near impossible, but that there was a reduction from, even at the height of the surge in 2012, there was a reduction over time, even though more kinetic operations were taking place, because command emphasized civilian protection. Tactical directives were issued to restrict indirect fires in residential areas, to restrict airstrikes in residential areas, to limit, limit the use of night raids. And again, these positive things within the accountability framework, I know that our discussion is about accountability. I mean, it is different from, investigating and if violations were found and people being prosecuted for those. And I mean, there's a huge bunch of challenges. And I know that in the follow-on discussion that Human Rights Watch will lead about some of the lack of accountability for violations from CIA operations and other things. And I'm not going to go into that, but I do want to, just emphasize that these positive things from an accountability and acknowledgement of losses that civilians suffered, both on the amends side and this other piece on good directives, policies to assess civilian harm, talk to witnesses, was enacted, and that was very positive.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. You framed it very well. And I think back to the time when I was at UNAMA in Afghanistan, and we would sit down and work through these things with NATO. And it was really interesting to see the way that they began the civilian casualty mitigation process and really started to work that through. And it was great when I was there to work with CIVIC. CIVIC was always at the table. You spoke about the concept of amends, and I was hoping that you could explain it more to our audience. Particularly, people become very critical about the idea when they think that it's just about putting cash money out to people. And oftentimes I would hear from NATO, for example, that, well, people just lie. They just want a payment. And so I was hoping that you could explain the concept of amends and the idea that, one, that it doesn't always have to be cash, and then secondly, reflect on this idea that civilians are coming forward just to try to take advantage of a system.
Yeah, so again, amends is again, it's a policy concept or something that has been enacted by mainly the US, but other militaries as well in ISAF, as I was mentioning earlier. But I mean, it really drives from the recognition, and again, going to IHL principles on recognition, the principle of humanity and recognizing and dignifying victims' losses. And again, there's the correlation with the reparations framework, which is a legally binding obligation for governments and armed actors to investigate and provide effective remedies and full compensation or restitution and accountability in terms of violations. But amends is just different, right? It is what we try to sort of advocate for, because you would just run into this stumbling block that no, this is permissible within our rules of engagement, that the lawyers have looked into it and this is collateral harm. It is permissible. It's regrettable, but it's happened. And so what we really advocated for is that, okay, if you have done your legal analysis and this is not considered a violation, then you still need to acknowledge to the families that they have suffered losses. And because it is about recognizing humanity and dignifying their losses. So, and amends, what we had a whole, sort of guidelines on how you would effectively provide amends. It would be acknowledgement. It would, if a government or military decided to provide any sort of medical assistance or financial assistance, you need to get input from the community. It has to be culturally appropriate because, in Afghanistan, it is part of the culture to provide some sort of financial assistance as a recognition of somebody's loss or harm that they have suffered. So if a decision is made to provide some sort of financial assistance or medical assistance, it should be culturally appropriate. Of course, nothing is going to bring back the loss of a loved one, and I don't even that whatever money or its assistance that was provided under the amends program in Afghanistan, the ISAF. Again, these were determined by the different militaries. But CIVIC has really emphasized the acknowledgement piece, apologizing, recognizing, and then changing practices, right? And when you do your own assessments and investigations, you should make public what your findings are. Or if you can't discuss it publicly for whatever reasons to the entire world, talk to the family, acknowledge what has happened. Because so amends has that component too.
Can you go into the issue of when people come in and they're asking for some type of amends, and when ISAF or others would push back and say, you can't trust civilians, people are coming in with reports of civilian harm, we know we didn't do it. What kind of issues are you dealing with when you're working with militaries and you're trying to get them to recognize civilian harm on the ground and realize that they don't have the full story?
Well, yeah, I mean, what we have encouraged and advocated for is that all militaries should be engaging with either the host nation government, with the NGOs that are on the ground, because NGOs have access to areas that the military may not be able to go to. They can help verify incidents. And having that kind of input from, speaking to community leaders, hearing from the community about what happened, actually speaking to witnesses about what happened helps in the verification process. And I agree, from a military lens, it was like, oh, this is false. We don't know. Our internal data is showing something very different. And I think there has to be a trust building component in any sort of initiative that any armed actor takes in any military operations. Like, how do you build trust where civilians can come and talk to you, NGOs can come and talk to you and share what has happened, and that you have policies and practices that will look into it and assess the credibility of it, and then you have your own internal data because you're tracking incidents and you're tracking where your munitions are being dropped and you're tracking where your forces are conducting operations. So there's like a dialogue, and then you can verify the process and you can verify these incidents. And then when you are going out to and making and acknowledging publicly, yes, mistakes were made, and you acknowledging publicly that, or maybe privately to the family, that we are going to assist you, I think that builds trust. That builds this, transparency is very important in this area to build trust, so that on both sides. And again, from the military's lens too, they're like, we don't want to deal with false allegations. But again, in order for them to effectively do this work, they need to have proper personnel who's trained, who understands that, military operations should have a significant component of civilian protection embedded in all phases, in the preparation, planning, civilian-centric analysis of your military operations, so that you understand how civilians are going to move and behave in a particular area, how civilians will react if you go knock on their door and says, hi, I want to apologize to you. Maybe they don't want your apology. They will look at you as hostile. I mean, so you really have to do this. There's just so much that the current militaries don't do to get enough information from communities, from civilians, that would really actually make them more operationally effective and not have to deal with the blowback, or even just deal with the problems of, and they don't, I think most militaries, they're not, of course there are some whose modus operandi is to deliberately attack and not adhere to IHL principles. But most militaries that I speak to you want to adhere to the key principles of distinction, proportionality, precautions, but they don't know how to, because they're just not trained to have a civilian-centric protection lens integrated into the entire battle plan.
I really appreciate the points that you've just made, and it really ties into the morning session that we had here. We had the mayor of Hawija, and as you know, there was the airstrike in Hawija in which many Iraqis were killed by a Dutch airstrike. And Erin has been involved in the investigation of that and putting a report together for us. And I was really struck by one thing that he kept coming back to, and that was just this desire for acknowledgement and for the government to explain to the people what happened, why it happened, and acknowledge the loss. And I think that was a really important point that you raise here. Now, you spoke about some of the positive sides of what ISAF did, and I go back to specifically the on-the-ground investigations. They had the JIATs, the Joint Initial Assessment Teams, and they actually went on the ground and did investigations. And I'm quite struck that we've lost that thread, and we've lost a number of the positives that ISAF had implemented. And I would hope that you could speak about how we've lost that thread over the years since ISAF left, Resolute Support took over, and we've moved to other conflict areas as well.
Good question. So when the mission was transitioned from ISAF to RS, some of us were going to NATO headquarters in Brussels and really advocating that good practices should be integrated into the Resolute Support mission on civilian harm mitigation. And all of these good directives, amends, assessments, etc., should be part of the mission, and that this should also be shared with Afghan security forces, because they were now going to be in the lead as part of, and the RS would be, training, advising, equipping, and partnering with them. So when that transition was happening, we got some positive feedback, but the RS mission was was much smaller than ISAF. The footprint was very reduced, and unfortunately, there were some really positive things back in 2015. CIVIC actually was engaged with RS in transferring the civilian casualty mitigation team and creating that for Afghan security forces. In 2017, the Afghan government enacted a civilian casualty mitigation policy, which was terrific. NATO also has this POC policy that came out in 2016. But as the mission changed its focus and the strategy changed to put pressure on the Taliban to come to the negotiating table, the kinetic operations increased dramatically. And of course, if you're going to increase kinetic operations, you're going to drop, more bombs, munitions were dropped in 2019 than in the height of the surge in 2012. And Mark, you and I wrote an article about this, back in 2020. But what we saw was, so more kinetic operations are taking place, and we saw an increase in civilian harm attributed to U.S. forces and within the umbrella of Resolute Support. And the poor Resolute Support civilian casualty mitigation team was pretty much understaffed, didn't have enough resources. And they were not going out and doing assessments on the ground. They were relying on data from their own internal reporting, and they were relying on data from the Afghan military. And of course, but they were engaging with UNAMA on a monthly basis, but there was less transparency, there was less engagement. And I remember, Chris, your Airwars and Bureau of Investigative Journalists, they would go to RS and they would not be able to have proper information coming from them. And it was such a sea change from the kind of transparency, open engagement that ISAF had. And RS was very sort of inward looking. And, it seemed, and when I used to go to Kabul, even, and I would raise these issues, it was as if all those good practices, hard-fought lessons were just cabined in one area. You keep hearing, yes, the commander is very interested in ensuring civilian casualty mitigation policies and practice are integrated, but we didn't see it in practice. And even the CCMT, the RS civilian casualty mitigation team, would just share that they were very frustrated. They didn't have complete visibility on what certain elements, especially special forces, were doing. They didn't have complete visibility. So they didn't have enough personnel. They didn't have complete visibility about certain elements of the missions and what they were doing because of different mandate secrecy. And again, the political strategy changed, right? So you had a lot of kinetic operations 2019, and most of them were taking place in rural areas. And there is data to support that also caused more people to join the Taliban against the Afghan government and the U.S. forces, because a lot of them were being impacted from the kinetic operations. And the brunt of the war for the last 20 years has been felt in rural areas in Afghanistan. Of course, there's been the horrific suicide bomb attacks in the urban areas and stuff by ISIS and Taliban, but the brunt of the 2 decades of war has been felt in the rural population. And it was very frustrating to see, hard-fought lessons for so many of us. And even within the military, you have to give credit to the military, to ISAF commanders who made some unpopular decisions to prioritize civilian protection, and to suddenly see all that dissipate as if they didn't even know that this happened, because the good lessons are not integrated in the various militaries. They're not disseminated properly. It's as if, the mission has changed, so the emphasis has changed. And that is it's very frustrating, but also it's we all are in this space to advocate for these good practices. And then because we see what the toll is on civilians, and then the civilians are like, well, what do you mean that we should trust this military? They're going back to their bad practices.
I really appreciate that point. I think what I'm going to do now, we're going to be putting a poll up, and I'm going to ask our team in the back to post the poll for our viewers. I'm going to give them a few minutes to take a look at the poll, which asks about ISAF's ex gratia payments and whether or not that was a good example. And while we give them a few minutes to do that, Sahr, I wanted you to answer a question that actually came from the audience. And the question was, if the military was to go out and meet with civilians in the field to do these investigations and to have that emotional connection, how could that impact reform?
That's a very good question. I think putting a name and a face to somebody who has suffered a loss is very powerful. And I think that makes, there's a human element to it, right? If you're just looking at everything from remotely, ISRs and your intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, you have your drone feed, you're just looking at little flashlights. They're human beings, so I think, like any sort of criminal investigation, you have to talk to witnesses. I mean, that is the fundamental principles of any investigations, right? Or assessments to find out what happened, how it happened, and actually interacting with civilians. I mean, I think it also humanizes the war because you see what is happening to these families, and I think it is a very important that you're from as I said, from an because again, soldiers have to also operate from a legal lens, but from most militaries have a certain kind of honor code or an ethos that they want to abide by, and I think that when they also see this, it sort of reinforces this ethical value of conducting military operations and fighting. And secondly, it's just actually speaking to witnesses, it makes your case stronger, right? I mean, you actually have the evidence to build a case about what happened. I mean, it was very frustrating, and I'm sure Chris and can sort of relate to this. Is like, even for Iraq and Syria, for OIR, I remember calling CENTCOM like, "Oh, we have witnesses. Do you want to talk to them?"
Yeah, no, it's very frustrating.
Like, oh, can't do that.
Yeah, no, it's incredibly frustrating. I appreciate it. I want to ask you to stick with us. We're going to have a Q&A in a few minutes. We've got back the poll answers from our audience, and I find it interesting. It's kind of like a bell curve. And I was talking to Erin about this earlier, and at least for me, I look back on my career and see the ISAF mission and the civilian casualty policies that they had as really the gold standard that we've seen during our careers. And it's the gold standard, and it wasn't all that great. It still had a number of issues to it. And so I think we've got a large mountain to climb up. I'm going to turn now to Erin and ask Erin to go and speak to our next panelist. Thanks a lot, Sahr.
Yes, thank you, Sahr. Thank you, Chris. Also interesting to see how the audience is quite divided in terms of whether it's a good example of providing accountability. Sahr, indeed, do please stay on so that we can also enjoy your expertise in the Q&A. I think what I'm taking away from this, as you've stressed, we actually saw quite good examples, or at least quite a lot of progress being made in ISAF, which, as Sahr has been stated, sort of that knowledge or that good practice has been lost to some extent. And I think that's actually a very good bridge to our next case study, US Africa Command, where we will definitely see that transitions to more aerial warfare have come at a cost for civilians in terms of finding answers, in terms of getting that accountability that they want. So to turn to our next speakers, Abdullahi and Chris, who will be talking about the US Africa Command. Good to know is that we will be discussing AFRICOM specifically in relation to their operations in Somalia, where they have been carrying out mostly aerial warfare in their fight against terrorism against Al-Shabaab. This has been ongoing for quite a few years already, but since 2020 we have seen quite a remarkable step by the Africa Command, where they actually put up this online reporting form where people can report allegations of civilian harm. So the idea behind this being that if you are a Somali, or you know someone, or you're a civil society organization, you know of a case where US military operations in Somalia have actually resulted in civilian deaths, that you could use this online portal to make that allegation directly to the military itself. I think only recently we've seen that, specifically in the case of Somalia, there has been more attention for civilian deaths as a possible occurrence after US operations, in case of targets having been missed or misidentified. Amnesty has been absolutely instrumental in bringing this to light, for instance, in a great groundbreaking report, which I think came out in 2019, maybe even earlier, where they investigated a select number of cases where US operations had actually resulted in civilian deaths, challenging the then dominant narrative that the US military wasn't causing civilian harm in Somalia. Abdullahi, I already see you on our screen, so thank you so much for being here. It's great to have you with us. Maybe before we go to that online reporting forum that is the topic of this session, could you provide our audience with a bit more of an introduction to what kind of US operations we are currently seeing in Somalia and how that impacts civilians?
Thank you so much, Erin. So the US military, especially AFRICOM, have been carrying out airstrikes in Somalia for many years right now. Since 2017, when President Trump became president, we have seen a tremendous increase in the number of airstrikes that were carried out. And since then, I think over 200 airstrikes were carried out, and allegations of civilian harm emerged, which is why we started investigating those allegations. We came across, we investigated more than 15, 17 cases, but then right now, from the 9 cases we investigated, we were able to independently establish that 21 civilians were actually killed and 11 more were injured. And that is where we are, where we were in 2020, when AFRICOM started looking back into, into these allegations to address the issues that have been raised. And which is why they started the online reporting portal, and they have also started the civilian casualty assessment reports in early 2020. The only thing that is missing right now is compensation to these families. And in terms of background, the US military is fighting with the armed group Al-Shabaab in Somalia. And they are in parts of the southern central part of the country where there is lack of internet access, and these airstrikes have been taking place. In that context, people will be killed. It's very difficult to ascertain or know when these allegations emerge and to investigate, because human rights defenders, human rights researchers, and independent journalists are unable to travel to these remote areas. So you have to do a lot of investigative work to even ascertain civilian harm. I think the number of civilian harm is greater than what Amnesty and others like Airwars reported. And there is a need to carry out more investigations to know the actual truth about civilian harm.
Yeah, thank you, Abdullahi. And I think this immediately ties into one of those lessons learned that then was a lesson lost that Sahr already mentioned, is the fact that in Somalia we do not see these ground investigations into civilian harm. Now, what I would like to discuss, because I think you already touched upon it a little bit, is that actually when it comes to the Africa Command, we've seen quite an overhaul in their practice. For a long time, there was no transparency whatsoever. Then all of a sudden, in 2019, we start to see some changes. There is a civilian casualty tracking team that's being implemented. There is this web portal, which I think if we pull up a slide, we can show people in the audience what that looks like, where they can actually, people make that report of a civilian casualty allegation. There are the civilian casualty assessment reports that you were mentioning, Abdullahi. Now, in your work for Amnesty, you've spoken quite a lot to civilians that have been affected by US military operations. And I think Amnesty was also one of the first maybe to actually be advocating for these kind of direct reporting avenues for civilians. Could you introduce the channel to us in a slightly greater detail, and also tell us about how Somalis perceive it and if it's even being used?
Yeah. So after our investigations and after publishing our reports, one key issue we identified was the fact that people who are reporting civilian harm, who are making allegations of civilian harm, did not know how to do it. The Somali government did not put in place any mechanism where these people can report this. the U.S. military did not also provide any mechanism to provide, for people to report these harms. So we included that as a recommendation in our report, and we made it one of our advocacy, points for the U.S. military or the Somali government to establish a safe and accessible mechanism where people can report civilian harm. And this online reporting portal was a result of, of that. So what the portal is, a link within the AFRICOM website where civilians can access and log in and input names and dates and information about the civilian harm that they are reporting, and it's hosted within the AFRICOM website. The website is in English. It is also can be translated into Somali. So this is a very good step, and we actually welcomed it, and we think it is very good to have this online reporting portal, because people like us or other human rights defenders or civil society members in Somalia are able to log in, and even journalists, independent journalists, can log in and report civilian harm. But then it is not enough, especially for Somalis who live in Al-Shabaab controlled areas, who do not, first of all, understand English, who do not, who do not have access to internet, and who do not know how to operate complex, devices, online devices, and also the portal also lacks human interaction. You don't know what happens with the information you provide, and many Somalis I have spoken to, especially families and victims, raise these issues, and they prefer other avenues, for them to make this kind of reporting, which are more accessible and safe for them.
Yeah. So Abdullahi, maybe as a final question before we switch to Chris, you've already, like you mentioned, that you've spoken to Somalis who prefer other channels. Could you tell us anything, if you know, about Somalis who have used this portal and sort of what happened? So you fill in the details in this form that we see, and then what?
That's a good question. Actually, it is very difficult. I asked a number of people, especially families and victims we interviewed, and one of them told me they used the online reporting portal, but then that was the end of the story. They said they inputted the information, they requested, they raised the issue through the portal, but then nothing has come out. They don't know whether the information was received. They did not receive any feedback. They did not, they did not get any response. What they encouraged, what they said in most cases, was for AFRICOM to establish an accessible means for people to do this. And I can go into the recommendations they were making. And that is establishing a physical office in Mogadishu or in other cities in Somalia where people can access, safely go and report. They also mentioned toll-free online, toll-free numbers where people can call and report these harms. And they also talked about, the U.S. Embassy or the consular mission taking more responsibility and inviting people to report this kind of harm. Those were some of the things they will prefer to happen.
Yeah, thank you, Abdullahi, and also thanks for already pointing out some viable alternatives or even additions. Chris, if you are here, I would like to ask you another question about this. Because as director of Airwars, I think you have studied a whole range of conflicts. You have studied a range of security actors. So you know quite a lot about the kind of answers that people are getting, but also that they are seeking when it comes to civilian harm in remote warfare. Could you sort of reflect on this portal and sort of how extraordinary, or maybe not at all extraordinary, the implementation of this portal by AFRICOM is?
Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for Sahr and Abdullahi for really helpful thoughts on this. I mean, the portal's a reasonable engagement by AFRICOM, and to put this into context, we're 12 years into the current US military engagement in Somalia, and for 10 of those years, there was zero accountability for civilians in Somalia. Not a single death or injury was officially admitted by the United States. So, the US was beginning from a very low base here. It has introduced some really helpful reforms since General Townsend took over at AFRICOM, and I think there's some interesting context about what he brought to this from his experiences in Iraq and Syria. So it wasn't just the portal. He started, AFRICOM started to officially admit pretty much all of their strikes, quarterly CIVCAS reports, a permanent civilian casualty team. And also, interestingly, earlier this year, for the first time in those 12 years, AFRICOM senior commanders sat around the table with Somali and international civil society organizations and talked through, in great detail, actually, the sort of practicalities of civilian harm mitigation and how things could be improved. So we welcome all of these changes. They're all good. They're all positive. And we would currently rate AFRICOM as, among the US combatant commands, as the most accountable, particularly against, for example, CENTCOM, which is the other heavily active US military command. I think the problem we have with this is that all of this could disappear again in a year or two. As Sahr said, we see this time and again that too often we have to rely on what we call commander intent in the absence of DoD frameworks, Pentagon frameworks that sort of bind all of this together, that have, best practice standards that monitor and adhere to those standards. It's time and again up to individual commanders to make decisions, positive or negative, about whether they're going to prioritize civilian harm. And just as a coda to what Sahr was saying about ISAF and Resolute Support, it's very interesting, I think, that in the summer of this year, before the terrible Kabul strike, the Resolute Support CMIT team had been completely wound down and folded back into CENTCOM in Tampa. And we were hearing, even before the Kabul strike that killed those 10 civilians, that CENTCOM was being very problematic for UNAMA, a 20-year relationship the US military had with the United Nations. And suddenly CENTCOM wasn't even answering basic questions from the UN on civilian harm concerns. So we very much welcome the portal. I think the portal could be a lot better. I think there are other mechanisms that could be pursued. And I hope they sustain, but there's nothing to ensure that they will. And CENTCOM is a very sad case in my view. 5 years ago, we would have rated CENTCOM the most transparent US military command, the most accountable. But since General McKenzie came in a couple of years ago, incidentally, 10 days after the Baghouz strike that is causing such uproar in the United States right now, with close similarities to the Hawija cover-up, we've seen a real decline, a sharp and hard decline in CENTCOM accountability for civilian harm. In Iraq and Syria last year, the US-led coalition whose CMIT processes are run by CENTCOM, there was an 80% collapse in the number of cases the coalition deemed to be credible. That is, they just stopped listening to civilians and what civilians were saying about the deaths and injuries that were occurring within their communities. So we would absolutely welcome the positive changes at AFRICOM. We are nervous, as our partners are, that these, at best, may only be temporary. The CIA campaign in Somalia, by the way, is still completely unaccountable, and we are reasonably certain there is still a low-level CIA campaign running, which is completely non-declared, and those casualties from that campaign never admitted. So, it's a good start. There are some great steps forward there, but we are very concerned that there's just not the framework to bind this and lock this in so that we can keep building on better standards and learn from conflict to conflict to improve on accountability for civilian harm.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I think it's a very valid concern, and you're already touching upon something very interesting when you're also making that comparison to the Central Command, so CENTCOM, because I've also been looking into Yemen and the fact that there is no such similar system in that context. Well, you could pretty much compare the type of operations that I think that are occurring in both these contexts. Do I understand you correctly that it's really a matter of leadership, whether the fact that there is such inconsistency or other factors at play to explain these differences across the US military?
I think we would primarily see it as leadership, both military leadership and political leadership. And one of our arguments in the Netherlands right now, in the UK, in France, and of course in the United States, is that without political oversight, militaries cannot be expected to hold themselves properly to account. Sarah Holowensky, the former head of CIVIC, former advisor to the Joint Chiefs of Staff at Pentagon, now at Human Rights Watch Washington, talked about it this week as the military being allowed to grade their own homework. And that is the problem. And we see it time and time again. So military leaders can make a great difference, both positively and negatively. In the mid-2010s, we saw a whole cadre of leadership come through who had learned from Afghanistan and the original occupation of Iraq the very high cost of not taking seriously civilian harm. Unfortunately, that cadre has now moved out, and there's a new generation of commanders coming through who are less attuned on civilian harm. And this is why political leadership is always needed. Parliaments, senates, holding militaries properly to account, making them go back and account for their actions and activities. Because without that political backstop, we can't, I sadly don't feel, trust militaries to do the best job. And we're talking about the US here, and I must say, the US, of course, comes in for a lot of criticism, and rightly so, but it is also the best we have right now. If we want to look at European militaries, their accountability for civilian harm is disastrous. France, Britain, Denmark, Netherlands, Belgium, if you look at all of those countries, their accountability for deaths and injuries from their actions is pretty much non-existent right now. So those countries could learn a great deal from the United States.
Yeah. Thank you, Chris. I think, Abdullahi, going back to you also again. So we're discussing this portal as an initiative that has been taken by a security actor to work towards enhanced accountability. Sort of seeing all the limitations that we've discussed, I think, in the panel so far, would you say that this practice by itself of making this reporting channel, is this something that we need to be replicating to other contexts, you think, to other security actors?
I think it is. I think it's one of the solutions. I don't think it will answer all the, all the questions that civilians who are harmed are raising. And I think it is a good point for me right now to actually refer to four guidelines and principles that I've put together from the UN resolution on basic principles and guidelines on the right to a remedy and reparation for victims of gross violations of international human rights law and serious violations of international humanitarian law, which was adopted in 2006. And I think those four principles, if adopted across, U.S. military commands, I think might help the situation and might come up with good mechanisms. The first one is the dissemination through private and public mechanisms, information about all available remedies to victims. So victims should have, mechanisms that provide information to them on how to do this. Number two is to minimize the inconvenience to victims and their representatives. So the online portal is one, but then it could be still inconvenient to some people because those who do not speak English, those who do not have internet access, those who do not have the technical know-how to operate digital devices, it's inconvenient to them. So to minimize, to come up with a mechanism that minimizes this inconvenience to victims and civilians is also important. And the third one is to provide appropriate legal and diplomatic and consular means for victims to exercise their right to remedy. So where US has missions or embassies, they should provide this legal mechanism and avenues for them to do so. And lastly, if the state that is involved in the civilian harm is either unwilling or unable to meet their obligation, the states where these violations are committed should establish a national program for reparation and other assistance to those victims. So when we don't have the US military, when the US military does not come up with other alternative means for people to report and for people to access reparations and other forms of affordability, then it is the responsibility of the state in which these violations occur to provide these mechanisms. I think I will stop there.
Yeah, thank you, Abdullahi. I think these are great points. Let's hope we take them away. I think we already discussed the fact that you are aware of Somalis who have actually used this portal and then didn't receive any follow-up. And I think if we're discussing this in terms of an accountability mechanism, the important question, of course, is does it lead to actual change? So I think either to you, Abdullahi, or Chris, are either of you aware of cases that have been brought to the US military through this portal that the US military has then maybe reinvestigated and has actually acknowledged that it did inflict harm where it previously didn't acknowledge this?
I think AFRICOM has referenced a couple of cases where it has reopened investigations which it says were driven by the portal. But although it seems highly likely that what's more likely to drive AFRICOM reviewing civilian harm is local reporting, both media and social media reporting, investigations by organizations like Amnesty and engagements with organizations like Airwars. So I think right now, the voices of affected communities themselves are at the bottom of the pile in terms of AFRICOM engagement. And it's back to that critical point about AFRICOM not investigating. And we did ask them this when we sat around the table with them earlier this year, why they didn't investigate, why they don't have Somali language experts on their team. They did say that they would look at it. They didn't say they were closed to it at AFRICOM. So at least there was a possibility there. But if you look at Inherent Resolve, which is, the massive US-led campaign against Iraq and Syria, where the coalition has investigated assessed more than 2,100 alleged civilian harm events. Only once did they go in on the ground and investigate. Once out of 2,100 events. That's how difficult it is to get the US military to do investigations of the kind we think should be standard. If it's safe for militaries to go in, even after the event, they should be going in, they should be talking to communities. And like ourselves, they should be finding other ways of talking to communities if they can't physically get in on the ground. It's not impossible. And new technologies are increasingly opening up communities, for that kind of communication.
Yeah. Thank you, Chris. I think, Abdullahi, to you, the same question, whether you've heard of changes following use of this portal.
From both our meeting with AFRICOM early this year and also from their own public reporting, it was not very clear to me whether the cases that were reopened by AFRICOM were as a result of the reporting from through the online portal, because there was a reference, as Chris said, there was a reference to reporting made by civil society groups, reporting made by journalists, reporting made through social media. So it was not very clear whether reports that were made through the portal led to either the opening of investigations or reopening of closed investigations. That was not clear to me. But if I remember correctly, there was a mention that some civilians used the online reporting portal and they were able to have access to some information or some allegations through the portal.
Right. Thank you, Abdullahi. At this point, I think it's moving away a little bit from the portal, but I think it is an important issue to address when we're talking about accountability. Abdullahi, you already raised the fact that the one thing you said that is still missing is actually compensation, which in a way is odd because we see a step where the US Africa Command is actually admitting to a very limited, but still admitting to a number of civilian deaths. We also know that they have a fund in place to make these kind of ex gratia payments. Do you have any idea why, with all those sort of conditions in place, we aren't seeing actual payments being made to affected Somalis?
I think that is a very important question. If the funds are available, the question is why is the U.S. military not making, the effort to compensate families, including those they have already admitted to. We know they have admitted to 13 civilian casualties, 5 deaths and 8 injuries so far from 4 different cases. The question is why are they not providing remedy and compensation when they have the money? And the answers I got through my research and through talking to various stakeholders is that there is fear that people might fabricate cases and might say they might request for compensation that they do not deserve, or sometimes if such compensation is made, it may fall in the hands of other entities such as Al-Shabaab and other armed groups, and it is a bit difficult for them to ascertain who is eligible for this compensation and who is not eligible for this compensation. There are a number of reasons people are coming up with on why AFRICOM is not making these payments. But we can talk of other ways of doing reparation. It's not only about monetary. There are other ways they can also do this. From all the Somalis I have spoken to, they prefer monetary compensation. Every Somali whose family was harmed, they think the most practical way for them is to get monetary compensation. But then proper acknowledgement, proper apology, access to the full truth when they are making these reports. So, for example, AFRICOM just post their statements on their website and share it with media. That's not enough. AFRICOM should be able to go to the Somali radios. They should talk to Somali media. They should make sure that the apology is delivered properly. The acknowledgement is made clearly. There is access to full truth and information about what happened to specific cases, because sometimes they say they admit to this, but then there is no much detail and information on relating to the events that led to this. They can also make symbolic reparations where they can build schools or provide group or community symbolic reparations, and also the guarantee of non-repetition, where they can do both legal reforms to their operations, to their rules, engagement rules, and also publicly say that they will not, they will not repeat those mistakes. Those are different ways they can also deliver reparation.
Thank you, Abdullahi. And I think this is also, I think it's, first of all, very good to hear of these alternatives, but I think also Sahr, in the previous case that we discussed, really brought home like the importance of providing this kind of acknowledgement and recognition for people that have been affected. I want to thank you both for your contributions. I do have a final question, but first I would like to ask my colleagues to open the poll again, where we're actually asking the same question as we did last time, only then in relation to AFRICOM's reporting channel. So could people whip out their phones and answer the question whether they think it's a good example of providing accountability? While people are putting this in Slido, I would like to ask one final question to Chris and Abdullahi, which is actually this same question. If you see this sort of taking all the limitations into account, would you say that we're actually looking at a good example of accountability or providing accountability or not? So how would you position yourselves on the scale of 1 to 5? Maybe first Chris and then Abdullahi.
I mean, I mentioned commander intent earlier on, and to me, this is fascinating. We worked with General Townsend back when he was leading the fight against ISIS at its most intense period. And we had very public spats with General Townsend. And he actually took time out during the last stages of the war to write an attack piece on Airwars in foreign policy, which I think showed how cross he was. But actually, all the time we were clashing with him, his senior team would continue to work with us and introduce some of the most radical innovations the US military had introduced at that stage, things that have now we see in places like Somalia. So, for example, monthly CIVCAS reports, even admissions of civilian harm, a permanent CIVCAS team working with civil society organizations, trusting external sources on their assessments of civilian harm and determining civilian harm from that. And I think Townsend took that with him to AFRICOM. So we welcome that. But I go back again to my other point is what happens when General Townsend leaves? What happens to all of these positive changes? How do we prevent another ISAF scenario where in just a short period of time, all these hard-won changes that do save lives stop working, disappear, and suddenly they're no longer there for us to benefit from in terms of mitigating civilian harm. So that's the challenge. I think AFRICOM is doing a relatively good job, and I think they are sincere and committed on this. I want to see from the Pentagon how it intends to enshrine that best practice and not just, if we've got good practice emerging in AFRICOM, why isn't that being applied in Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria or Libya or Yemen? Why does it only appear and disappear in one theatre? I think that's something we have to really understand.
Thank you. Abdullahi, your final reflections?
Yeah, I agree with Chris' assessment. I think maintaining the portal is really important because it is currently the only available mechanism for civilians and for victims and for civil society groups who are working on this. So I think it's really important to keep the portal. I think maybe one recommendation will be to make the reporting portal more visible and easily accessible to people, either by establishing a separate reporting portal or website in Somali or in English or in other language, so that it's not lost within the bigger AFRICOM website. I think that is one way they can improve it. And also, I think creating other mechanisms that are, that can support this, opening a physical office or other or toll-free telephone lines where they can engage with people and doing that. And I think it's also important for AFRICOM to make sure when they make assessments that they are able to communicate these assessments and the result of the assessment to families and victims themselves and not just share it, online and with media.
Yeah, thank you, Abdullahi. I think the last point also is particularly important. If we're looking at the poll results right now, I think we do see that I heard Christopher described as relatively good, which I think is sort of the overarching opinion of our audience as well. Though slightly more negative when compared to ISAF, which I think, Mark, probably won't surprise you. Thank you to all our speakers for this part of the structured discussion so far. It was great to all have you here. Just as a reminder, our in-person audience, if you want to ask a question to one of our speakers, now is the opportunity, and you can make your way to the microphone. For those participating remotely, please remember to exit full screen mode and then access the Slido module, and you can input your questions there. And then Mark will take over from here.
Thanks. All right. Well, I'm going to begin our Q&A with our panel, and I see that we have an individual here in the audience. Could you please provide your question to our panelists? Thank you.
In our conversation, I find it repeatedly important that we also take those larger contexts into account before we start into the nitty-gritty of trying to make these wars more human and make these wars better, or make these wars more perfect in some sort of sense. That we also have to reflect upon what are we actually trying to fix here, and where do we stand in relation to these bigger questions of perfecting wars that are basically illegal and wrong in the first place. So
thank you.
A lot to talk about.
A lot to talk about indeed. And I'd like to turn to you, Sahr, specifically on the first point, and looking at the issue of boots on the ground and how that relates to civilian casualties and civilian harm mitigation.
I think, first of all, any sort of use of force, it has to be guided by international humanitarian law. I mean, and the legal principles there. So whichever kind of intervention that any government is involved in. So that's really, really important. And for most of the organizations on this panel and others, our engagement is not on a, we don't talk to governments about their decision to engage in war. That has to be also within UN, the UN Charter, etc. But most of us are working on conduct of hostility issues. So it is about how do you mitigate civilian harm and how do you reduce and minimize the impact on civilians once the decision has been made to engage. And again, that's beyond CIVIC's mandate, etc. I just wanted to quickly mention that. But on the issue of again, so with ISAF, there were thousands of soldiers on the ground. In the initial intervention in Iraq, the U.S. had over 100,000 soldiers on the ground. And then, with OIR, Operation Inherent Resolve, Iraq, Syria, and even with AMISOM, at CT operations. But in Iraq and Syria, the U.S. and the coalition was working with partner forces. In Iraq, they were working with Iraqi security forces. In Syria, they were working with the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces. So it is really important that whatever, so it's not like just because there were not so many US personnel on the ground in Iraq and Syria doesn't mean that you still are not able to do and implement some of these good practices to mitigate civilian harm. You can work with your partner forces, train them on these issues, and get them to help you do the assessments, do the proper assessments on civilian harm, that there's unified rules of engagement as part of the coalition, that everybody involved in the fight knows that civilian protection should be prioritized. And I think those are some ways that, again, a lot of the Western militaries are relying on partner forces to do most of the work on the ground, whereas they're providing the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance assets, the using of airstrikes or training and equipping local forces. But again, I think this in this new way of fighting, at least from the Western military lens, that there is an obligation to train your ground forces to also adhere to IHL and to enact and implement these good policies and practices. And unfortunately, we continue to see a gap in this, at least, for example, Iraq and Syria. High intensity combat operations, but they were not really bringing their partners completely online with some of the practices and the Iraqi forces should have had a civilian casualty mitigation team. I remember I was in Baghdad and I'm saying, why aren't you integrating them into this? And they said, oh, because the Iraqis didn't ask us. That's just not a good enough excuse, In Afghanistan, I do think that's a good example where they were mentoring the Afghans on good practices of civilian casualty mitigation. Again, because, Afghanistan became sort of this birthplace of these good civilian harm mitigation practices. But there's still a long way for most of these militaries that are trying to mitigate, that have implemented these good policies and practices. They're not sharing them enough with their partner forces. And I think that's a big problem and a gap that we need to sort of address. Again, it is about ameliorate and trying to mitigate, again, from a legal lens, it is about minimizing incidental harm. It is about the constant care obligation to spare the civilians and civilian objects from the effects of war. And whoever is involved, either you're doing it remotely or you're doing it with partner forces, has to do it in a coordinated way. And the responsibility should not just be shirked off. Oh, they're a different partner force. No, you're giving them weapons. You are sharing intelligence with them. You need to bring them on board on how to mitigate civilian harm.
That's a really important perspective. Thanks very much. I want to turn now to Chris. Chris, I've got a question for you, and something that really gnaws at me on the reporting from Airwars. Oftentimes the response to you from the United States is that an incident is not credible. And I was hoping that you could speak to our audience about what that means and how the reply is, because you all send many dozens of reports to the United States, and the vast majority of them come back to you as being not credible. So how can it be that you're sending all of these reports and the information is clearly not very good?
Well, I mean, what the US is saying when it comes back and says it's not credible is we don't believe the civilian communities we've bombed. Let's be realistic about what they're saying here. We don't believe the communities that Amnesty and Human Rights Watch have gone in on the ground and interviewed. We don't believe the civilians who've been interviewed by the UN or OPCW or whoever's doing the investigating, or the remote monitoring that organizations like Airwars do, capturing what communities themselves are reporting. So, and interestingly, actually, AFRICOM doesn't use the credible, non-credible binary approach. They have a different language, which I think is a bit more progressive, that we welcome. There are just too many cases where Inherent Resolve has initially come back to us and claimed this is a non-credible case. The Baghouz case that has Washington in uproar at the moment, the killing of 70 civilians, possible war crime, the covering up of that case. Twice Inherent Resolve has come back and told us categorically that was a non-credible.
Really?
Yeah, twice on that event. And we reported mass deaths in that event within 24 hours. That was one of 5 reported massacres at Baghouz just in the month of March. And in fact, one of the things we'll be doing with the Pentagon investigation that's just been announced is really pushing for this to be a review, not just of a single strike, but of a systemic failing. Because almost none of the civilian deaths that were reported during that six-month Deir ez-Zor campaign have been admitted by the US-led coalition. There's been an absolute collapse in accountability. So it's something like 99% of the cases in the final Deir ez-Zor campaign have been deemed non-credible by the coalition. And that's an absurdity. So certainly sometimes there just isn't enough information. We recognize that, and we do work. Airwars does work with the CMIT team of the coalition, with AFRICOM, with CENTCOM in Yemen as well, on individual events. We help them to understand, information passes backwards and forwards. We try to improve on that understanding, but at its heart, this is about, do militaries listen to and believe communities? And I guess one final point for me, I've sat around the table at the Pentagon with senior commanders, and they've said, well, this exact point, how can you trust communities? How can you believe communities? And we usually just turn that on its head and say, well, 9 out of 10 of your strikes Communities are not reporting civilian harm. If this was a propaganda exercise, it would be far more widespread. But it's the 10% of your strikes that are going wrong that you need to be listening on. And your own systems are terrible at identifying those deaths and injuries. It's almost always going to be external reporting that helps militaries understand where, when, and how civilians have been killed, because their own assessment processes are so poor. So it's quite the opposite of not listening to communities. They need to listen to communities, and they need to build that trust with communities.
Thanks very much, Chris. I appreciate it. Abdullahi, I want to turn to you now. We unfortunately only have about 5 minutes left, but I want to bring up a question that really comes from the podcast that we did. And I just would like to let the audience know that I'm not only the military advisor at PAX, but also the co-host of the Civilian Protection podcast that I do with Annie Scheel, who's over at CIVIC. And Abdullahi was one of our guests on one of the podcasts, and I welcome you all to go to Spotify and listen to that. And you spoke about the problems of Somalis having to actually prove their own instances of harm and how difficult that is. And what is it like to civilians when they have to go and prove to a military that they've been harmed, and how difficult is that for them in Somalia?
Thank you. I think one issue that I need to also point out following Chris' remarks is that the difference in methodologies is key here. The methodologies we use is to go interview family members, witnesses, and understand that, these people more. We don't understand what methodologies AFRICOM uses. For example, when they put out assessment reports, they either say they substantiate a claim or a claim is unsubstantiated, but then we don't know the exact methodologies they deploy. We don't know whether they are speaking to family members, which we know is not happening. We don't know what other methodologies they are using. So it's very difficult to assess who is credible between between groups like us and others who are reporting, and between AFRICOM. It's very difficult to ascertain when we don't know what methodologies they are using. And to your point, it's very difficult for Somalis to, first of all, make these claims. And even those who are able to make the claims either on social media or to report to, Somali authorities, or even sometimes to the U.S. military, it's very difficult for them to get an answer. In that podcast, I spoke of the case of Mohammed Usman, who is a Somali journalist whose family member was killed and injured. Members were killed and injured in an incident in Jilib in Somalia. And he was able to have access to AFRICOM officers when they were training him, because he works for the government on reporting and counterterrorism operation in Somalia. And when he raised the issue was muted. He was not able to get any information from AFRICOM. They actually went ahead and issued a statement to say that individuals killed were terrorists, and he was very upset about it. When he continued to raise this issue, he also faced threats from other individuals within senior government officials. So he received both intimidation from Somali government. He did not receive any response from AFRICOM. And to make the matter worse, a statement was issued that the individuals killed who were his own relatives, who were civilians, were actually terrorists. Later, AFRICOM corrected this, and after their assessment, and they found that the individuals killed and injured, all the individuals killed and injured in that incident were civilians. So it's a very big challenge for people to report. And when incidents get reported by groups like us or Airwars or other independent groups working in Somalia, AFRICOM can still come back and say those allegations are unsubstantiated. So it's really a frustrating endeavor.
Thanks very much, Abdullahi. I appreciate it. I want to turn it to Erin now to take us out.
All right, thank you, Mark. First of all, I think a big thank you again to all of our speakers for participating in the session with a slightly complicated setup of one case, then another case, and then a joint Q&A. So also thank you all for sticking around and answering these questions from our audience and from Mark. I think, having said that, I also want to thank our in-person audience as well as those people watching online and having contributed to it. That really makes a difference for us sitting here as well. If there's like a lot of questions and a lot of poll results that we can work on, so that we greatly appreciate that. I think for now we are entering into a short break as for the program, and we will be back with a very interesting session on accountability once mission ends, and we will look at Afghanistan with also a very distinguished set of speakers, again facilitated by Mark. So I do encourage everyone online to come back after the break and do that discussion with us as well as our final session on accountability for civilians. Many thanks, and yeah, hope to see you in a bit.
Thanks, everybody.